Chapter 16. Sam. 1924. Another year. Another drought. Another hot day. Heat waves shimmered on the horizons, creating visions of pools of water where there was no water. Nothing grew. Cattle bellowed. Father worried. And Maddie wished they were anywhere but in New Mexico. What had happened that the rains no longer came? The bountiful crops they had grown the first years seemed like a far-fetched dream now. It was Sunday morning, and church services were to be held at the Noah Bontrager home. Maddie brushed her long brown hair. She parted it in the center, combed it straight back, and tied a long ribbon around her head. Next, she crossed the ribbon under her chin and held the ends in her mouth while she flipped her hair up, pinned it near the top, and curled the ends underneath. Taking the ends of ribbon from her mouth, she tied them at the nape of her neck. Then she settled her large black covering over her head and pinned it in place with 2 straight pins. The married women wore white coverings and the unmarried girls wore black. She donned her blue Sunday dress, the one she wore every Sunday, and pinned her cape in place. It was a piece of cloth that she folded to create a triangle, pinning a corner on each side of the neck and a corner at the waist. "Hurry up, Maddie," Giddle called from the doorway. Mary was combing 12-year-old Lydia at the kitchen table, and Maddie knew that she was not ready either. Why Giddle picked on her, she didn't know. She pulled on her stockings and hurriedly stepped into her black shoes. They hurt her feet when she walked, and she was glad she didn't have to wear them every day. They were hot, too. She went to the kitchen and offered to finish combing Lydia. It was quite a hassle getting everyone ready for church. Mother often said that she was more on time when the children were small than she was now. The air was humid this morning. The sun was shining so brightly and fiercely that Maddie felt as though she must surely smell like a workhorse. The sky, that usually seemed to rise eternally higher and higher, now pressed down on them, threatening to smother every unfortunate creature on the prairie. No one knew what the future held, but unless rain fell and they could raise pinto beans and oats as they had before, they most certainly would need to move east again. Father had his farm completely paid for and was in better financial condition than some of the other families, but nevertheless he stood in danger of losing everything he had brought with him from Kansas and had acquired in New Mexico. Already Jake and Ida had moved back to Kansas, and Dan and Polly were talking of moving to Indiana. Maddie would have her 21st birthday in October, and she was considering going back to Kansas too. She would be on her own then, and there was nothing holding her here. But what about Mother? Would it make it harder for her if she left? She would talk to her about it. While sitting in the Bontragers' living room that morning waiting for the service, Noah suddenly burst through the doorway and told everyone to come outside. Maddie and Mary looked at each other, wondering what could be so important. Curiously, they walked into the yard and looked in the direction that Noah was pointing. At first, Maddie couldn't see a thing, but after he mentioned a train, she suddenly saw a locomotive. She could even see the wheels turning. "But there's no railroad over there," Father said. "I know," Noah replied. "The closest train in that direction is about 28 or 30 miles away. But it's a mirage. You know, where you can see things a long way off?" Father nodded. He knew. He knew all about these mirages. Once, he had seen people walking on the streets of Gladstone, just as though he had been there himself. The long, hot summer passed, and Maddie was anxiously awaiting her birthday. Mother did not mind that she wanted to leave. She even encouraged her to. Mother realized that New Mexico was not a place for young people, with its harsh and often unpleasant life. She fully understood the longing in Maddie's heart to live in a settled and prosperous community, a settlement where the young people had singings and a proper social life. So, on October 28, 6 days after her 21st birthday, Maddie boarded the train at Springer, New Mexico, with Hutchinson, Kansas as her destination. She had written Jake and Ida earlier and informed them of her schedule. She hoped they would be waiting when she arrived. Maddie reclined on the green velvet seat of the passenger coach and watched the landscape rushing westward. Far out on the prairie, a herd of cattle slowly moved toward an unseen destination. A thick cloud of dust rose about them, and Maddie could almost feel the heat, the gritty sand, and the sharp backbones of the horses. She was glad she was an Amish girl on the train and not a cowboy on the prairie. New Mexico was for the cowboys, she thought, not for her. As she traveled eastward, she compared the stark landscape of New Mexico with the cornfields of Kansas, neatly shocked and ready to husk. Her heart felt heavy when she thought of the life Father faced. Would he recover from the severe losses he had endured the past 2 years? When the train neared Hutchinson, Maddie reached to the shelf above her and retrieved her bonnet, shawl, and purse. She straightened her back and sat stiffly, searching for familiar landmarks. Everything looked as she remembered, and yet she couldn't recognize anything in particular. It was all strangely familiar, yet strangely new. When the train began to slow, Maddie gathered her things and waited impatiently for it to stop. She couldn't see Jake and Ida's buggy at the depot, but more than likely they had a different horse than the one they had in New Mexico. When she at last stepped off the train onto the wide wooden platform, she couldn't see Jake and Ida at all. But a young Amish man stood beside a buggy on the west side of the building. At first she didn't think she knew him, but the next instant she recognized him as Nettie's younger brother Sam. He was walking toward her and smiling. She caught her breath. Surely he wasn't there to pick her up. "Hello, Maddie," he said. He stepped onto the platform and walked to her side. His blue eyes smiled into hers and bewildered her. He no longer had a Dutch boy haircut and was strikingly handsome. And how he had grown. "Hello, Sam," she returned his greeting. "Jake told me you were coming, so I asked him if I could pick you up." "Oh, well, that's all right with me," she laughed nervously. Turning to pick up her suitcase and other bags, she was surprised when he reached in front of her and took them. Then he carried them to his buggy and set them behind the seat. She climbed in and waited for him to untie his horse, a dark brown mare, old and shabby. Once settled in his seat, he slapped his horse with the reins, and they started for Jake's house. Sam asked many questions about New Mexico and about Tobe and Nettie. He smiled when she mentioned their little baby, and she thought he seemed pleased that they named her Maddie. She marveled that the little blonde-haired boy she had known as Sam Knepp had matured into the soft-spoken, kind-hearted young man. His hands were broad and strong as they lay idle in his lap, holding the reins loosely. His shoes were shining and clean, and he smelled fresh, with just a hint of cologne. For a few moments she felt extremely shy and nervous, but as they talked she relaxed, and all too soon they were at Jake's home. It was a small, clapboard house, neatly painted with a little yard. Sam carried her bags inside and stayed a few minutes to visit. Maddie felt happy indeed that Sam thought enough of her to want to pick her up at the depot. Before he left, he invited her to attend the singing the young people would have the following evening. She wanted to attend, but felt shy about meeting so many new people. The Reno County she had left 4 years earlier was not the Reno County she now saw, but she would go to the singing, of course. The next morning, Maddie met several of her cousins, Lydia, Melinda, and Anna, who welcomed her warmly. They asked her to sit with them during the Sunday service and eat dinner with them. Soon they were visiting like old friends. All during the singing that evening, the girls stayed by her side, introducing her to people she did not know or had not seen since they were children. Maddie was keenly aware of Sam across the room, and several times she thought he smiled at her. She liked him and wondered if he thought the same of her. The next week was filled with getting settled at Jake's and helping Ida. By the time the next Sunday arrived, Maddie felt as though she belonged in Reno County again. Church was to be held in the North District, which required quite a long drive. She didn't think she would stay for the singing since she would need to drive home in the dark. But Melinda persuaded her to stay and promised to take her home. That evening, after the adults left, the young people gathered in the kitchen, savoring the warmth from the stove. Kerosene lanterns cast soft shadows, dancing crazily over the walls. Lydia and Maddie shared books and occasionally led in songs. Sam's clear voice rang out over the rest of the group, and Maddie wished she could sing as easily. Suddenly, she wished for a nicer dress to wear. The blue one she wore was from the fabric she and Mary had purchased in Mills, New Mexico. Now, it seemed worn and drab, and she wondered how her hair looked. More than likely, Sam did not even think of her the way she thought he did. There were several other girls who had every hair in place, had nicer clothes, and would be happy to have him ask them for a date. She supposed he had picked her up at the depot only as a friendly gesture and did not mean anything serious about it. After refreshments were served, Maddie went to the bedroom to get her shawl and bonnet. The room was crowded, and at first she wasn't sure which were hers. Just as she found them, Melinda appeared at her elbow and whispered, "Sam wants to take you home." "Ah," was all Maddie could say. She thought every eye was on her and suddenly felt hot all over. What could she say? She had never had a date before and wasn't sure how to act. "Well, tell him it's all right with me," she stammered. Melinda smiled mischievously and disappeared through the doorway. Maddie turned back toward the other girls and wondered what she should do until Sam was ready to go. They all seemed aware that she had been asked for a date. She felt embarrassed and decided to wait in the kitchen. From there, she could see Sam standing casually beside the door. He was wearing his coat and appeared to be waiting for her. She twisted her handkerchief in her hand into a hard knot. Melinda came out of the bedroom and motioned to her to come outside with her. When Sam saw them coming, he opened the door and slipped out into the night. They followed and waited for him to bring the buggy to the house. When he came, Maddie bade Melinda good night, descended the steps, and walked to the gate as gracefully as possible. Sam helped her into the buggy, then walked around his horse and climbed in beside her. He pulled an old quilt around their knees. Maddie had seen nicer lap robes, but that didn't matter. Even his donkey of a horse didn't bother her. She didn't need a racehorse to take her home. Just so it was Sam. He was the nicest person she had ever known, and his quiet manner touched an unfamiliar chord within her heart. So this is what it's like to have a date, she thought. At first she hardly knew what to say, but soon she forgot her nervousness, and they had an enjoyable time together. The moon was nearly full, silver plating the landscape. The stones between the buggy wheels crunched, and occasionally a dog barked from a farmhouse. Sam's horse plodded along at an even pace, oblivious to the world, and Maddie wished Jake and Ida lived farther away so they could keep riding forever. The house was dark when they arrived, but Maddie soon found the lamp in the kitchen and lit it, turning the wick low. She wondered what she could get Sam for a snack, then remembered a tin of cocoa in the cupboard and knew Ida would not mind if she used some to make hot chocolate. It would be delicious after their cold ride home. They spent the rest of the evening at the kitchen table, talking about New Mexico, the death of his mother, and his father's remarriage. The impact of Katie's death had not fully registered with Maddie, being so far away, and Nettie had told them little about it. Life had not always treated Sam kindly, and Maddie thought maybe this was why he seemed older and wiser than his age would suggest. Now, Sam had a stepsister, Barbara Ann, of whom he thought highly. Maddie watched as he rubbed one hand over his knuckles, then picked up a spoon and turned it around and around. His voice rose and fell in soft tones as he spoke freely and openly of his pain and loss. Sometimes he grew humorous, or change the subject, but underneath ran a serious vein of wisdom far beyond his years. When the clock struck 12, they looked up, startled that time had flown so swiftly. "Well, Maddie, I've sure enjoyed the evening," he said, scraping back his chair and rising to leave. His presence filled the entire room. "So have I," she replied. "And thank you for the hot chocolate." "Oh, you're welcome." She stood and walked him to the door. He stopped and rested his hand on the knob. "Would you want to have another date next Sunday night?" he asked shyly. Warm circles chased around in her heart, and she again found it hard to speak. "Why, yes, that would be all right with me," she agreed. "Okay, the singing will be here in our district at David Fry's, so I'll bring you home again afterward." His blue eyes crinkled merrily at the corners, and Maddie couldn't help laughing. Everything he said seemed like a joke. He opened the door and said softly, "Good night, Maddie." She returned his farewell with a low, "Good night, Sam," and the door shut behind him. A minute later she heard him cluck quietly to his old horse, and the buggy was rolling down the lane and out of earshot. Maddie blew out the lamp and felt her way through the darkness to her bedroom. If she ever felt lonely, she would remember tonight, and if she was ever discouraged, she would remember Sam. His quiet strength inspired her. She would never forget him. End of chapter 16.